¿Qué tal? ¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes. ¿Cómo vamos llegando? Esto ya lo quito. Vamos comenzando. Quería comenzar antes, pero tuve varias cosas, ¿no? Desde hace días quiero volver a hacer este stream. Y quise planear como tal algo especial. Algo muy especial. Nada, como tal no es especial, ¿verdad? Solo quiero ver qué sale. Tengo planeado ver una secuencia de videos. ¿Por qué videos? Porque no los hago yo. Pues por tiempo y hueva. Pero veremos una secuencia de videos y al final sí me dedicaré a hacer un video. Miren en YouTube el próximo video. Tal vez salga la próxima semana por lo mismo de que no tengo tiempo. Pero si esta secuencia de videos técnicamente serán un previo al video que voy a realizar, que voy a desarrollar. Y si escuchan mucho sonido felino es porque aquí tengo ciertos gatillos que andan medio haciendo ruido. Pero bueno, creo que vamos a comenzar. Vamos a darle directamente. Y creo que esto también lo subiré a YouTube como video reacción. Porque a ver si con eso voy ganando gente. En fin. Pero bueno, comencemos. Comenzaremos con este video. Joe Rogan. A ver, permítanme mover esto para acá. Porque todavía voy viendo cómo acomodar estas cosas en mi pantalla. Apenas estoy desarrollando estas cosas. Pero en fin. En fin, comenzaremos con este video de Joe Rogan. ¿Por qué? Porque básicamente es un video en donde resumen. Joe Rogan tiende, ya, quien no sabe sobre Joe Rogan, él es un comentarista, técnicamente actor, pero casi ni siquiera actuaba, ¿no? Y también se había dedicado mucho a MMA. Y pues ha estado involucrado en todo eso. Y también es comediante, claro que sí, claro. Es muy buen comediante si agarra su cura. Y ahorita, pues su podcast creo que es el más escuchado en todo el mundo, creo. Tiene gente muy interesante, expertos, doctores, científicos, y es una de las personas que pues tiene teorías o mentalidades muy separadas de lo común y que no está mal, ¿no? Al final se aprecia la diversidad, pero pues está cabrón. Y en este video de Favorite Podcast, no sé cómo se dirá esto, ni siquiera sé si se escribe Favorite. Pues en este video hicieron una recopilación de cuando sus invitados o él hablan de antiguas civilizaciones. ¿Por qué? Porque veremos este video. Porque como tal, de nuevo, está vinculando a una teoría que yo tengo. Pero sí. No sé si voy a alcanzar a verlos todos. No sé si voy a alcanzar a ver uno. Pero pues ya ven. No sé si siquiera voy a alcanzar a iniciar el pinche stream. Chale. Vuelvo rapidito. Ya hemos regresado. No estoy seguro, estoy subiendo el volumen porque tiende a pasar que por alguna razón no me doy cuenta de que tan bajo está el volumen. El último stream, la grabación está súper baja. Me irritó mucho darme cuenta de eso muy tarde. Veremos cómo nos va. Permítanme un momento. Muy bien, solo haré una pequeña prueba de audio.
Because if you look at Europe during the Ice Age, and I'm talking about a lost civilization of the Ice Age.
Ahí está. Ya, estaba revisando qué tal el audio. Algo que he aprendido en mi nada de carrera es de que el audio es de lo más esencial. Ok, si me escucho alto, pues ahí me dicen, no creo que nadie esté viendo esto, pero pues ahí me dicen. Ay, se me olvidó. Este lado es un desastre mi acomodo. Pero bueno. Veamos qué pasa. Ok, pero pues, entonces, ¿qué pedo? Oh, espero que esto pueda se trabe. Como sea. Ok, entonces, sí, Joe Rogan, esto y esto y esto y aquello, ok. Es impresionante como los cabrones que se dedican a esto nunca tienen problemas. Es impresionante. Pero bueno, pues comencemos. También estoy haciendo un stream en Twitch, en YouTube y en Kick. Pero Kick siempre me tiene problemas. Siempre tiene algún problema. Es una gran plataforma, pero Dios mío, que me desespero lidiar con él. En fin, comencemos.
Because if you look at Europe during the Ice Age, and I'm talking about a lost civilization of the Ice Age, Northern Europe and North America were absolutely inhospitable wildernesses during the Ice Age. They were frozen, they were dry, and they were dangerous. And they were not...
No había notado que los subtítulos los tengo en inglés. Traducción automática. No sé si va a ser como tal. Si no saben inglés, ahí la tienen.
Because if you look at Europe during the Ice Age, and I'm talking about a lost civilization of the Ice Age, Northern Europe and North America were absolutely inhospitable wildernesses during the Ice Age. They were frozen, they were dry, and they were dangerous. And they were not the places that people would go. People naturally gravitated south towards the equator, towards the tropics. That's where I would expect to find traces of a lost civilization, and that's where I do find traces of a lost civilization.
Ok, empezamos. Ok, ¿de qué está hablando este don? Civilizaciones perdidas. Ok, ¿qué pedo con eso? Pues, comúnmente hay una teoría en donde establece que hace, pues, que serán siglos o más, quién sabe, había una civilización antigua. Por lo menos había antiguas formas de gente y la madre, ¿no? ¿Cómo es? Sigo batallando con esto de que, en fin. Y básicamente está explicando de que obviamente en aquellos tiempos pues la parte norte estaba súper congelada y que en la madre, y pues si al igual que los pájaros durante el invierno donde estaba más culero se movían a las partes calientes debajo del ecuador y todo ese pedo, pues obviamente aquellos que buscan fósiles o ese tipo de cosas pues van a ir más al ecuador, van a ir a zonas más que en esos tiempos eran más cálidas, ¿no?
You don't really find. I've never reported anything about the UK, for example, in my books. We have Stonehenge, we have Avebury, we have these stone circles, but they're not old enough. That was the time when the UK started to get warmer, and it's the same with the rest of Northern Europe, and it's the same with the northern part of North America. You have to go down to the southern part of North America, you have to go into Mexico, you have to go into South America to really find an environment during the Ice Age that would have nurtured a high civilization.
And there's a lot of speculation as to why they weren't able to cross the Bering landmass too, right?
Well, again, this is an area where there has been a narrative that archaeology has sought to impose upon us. And this was called the Clovis first idea, that there was a people who archaeologists called the Clovis people. We don't know what they called themselves, in North America. And traces of their characteristic tools, particular sort of fluted points, arrowhead spear points, turn up from about 13,400 years ago and end abruptly 12,800 years ago. And for a long time, with the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and for a long time, archaeology maintained that this Clovis culture, so-called Clovis culture, we don't know what they called themselves, were the first Americans, and that there were no human beings in the Americas before 13,400 years ago. And bit by bit, the new evidence has come in which has forced archaeologists screaming and tearing out their hair to back away from the Clovis first paradigm and admit.
Ok, básicamente el don está explicando que, pues, como nosotros normalmente sabíamos, los Clovis se supone que eran los primeros humanos que, pues, a lo que sabemos, ¿no? Que cruzaron desde Europa por el estrecho de Bering, que la madre, ¿no? Pero, ya ven, autos. Pero poco a poco se fueron dando cuenta que en realidad hay evidencia de que los humanos estuvieron aquí desde mucho antes que eso. Y pues fue un gran hallazgo, ¿qué pedo? O sea, ¿qué pedo? ¿Cómo es posible que haya humanos antes de los humanos? Y pues ha sido un hallazgo, ¿no? O sea, ha sido algo que pues poco a poco los científicos se han quedado anonadados, han encontrado nuevas especies de humanos y todo eso, ¿no? Poco a poco pues fueron dándose cuenta.
That actually, yes, there were people here before that. But even then, they're reluctant to go very far back. We've recently had these footprints in White Sands in New Mexico, 23,000 years old or so. That's largely being accepted now. But there are much earlier dates. There's 130,000 years ago from the Cerruti Mastodon site near San Diego. The Sphinx is supposed to have been built 4,500 years ago, but as you know, Robert Schoch and I and many others are convinced the Sphinx is much, much older than that it goes back 12,000 plus years.
And this is based on geological evidence of heavy rainfall, which is another interesting thing about the climate and the environment of that area, that we think of it as being desert, but at one point in time it wasn't.
Well, this is one of the reasons why I'm so frustrated by archaeologists claiming that they can know there was no lost civilization when they've done so little work in the Sahara, when the Sahara was, in a number of occasions during the Ice Age, incredibly fertile. very, very nurturing environment with huge river systems running through it and lakes. It's not disputed that that was the case. It was a kind of environment that would have nurtured human civilization. And we really can't write off the possibility of a lost civilization until we take a much closer, much more detailed look at the Sahara. Of course, that's expensive. And then Egypt itself is in the Sahara.
Didn't they find fossilized whale bones in the Sahara?
Yeah, that would go back a lot further. That would go back to millions of years, to a time when the oceans were different, perhaps even hundreds of millions of years.
So Sahara at one point in time was an ocean.
As many places were.
Wow.
Pretty much anywhere where you find limestone was once covered by ocean. The world has changed. The world is constantly changing. It's like one of those magic kids' toys where you pull a lever and it wipes out the diagram you just made. You know?
Yeah.
It just keeps on. The world keeps on recreating itself, and we human beings make our journey through this. Through this changing world, and we try to fix it and say this is how things were, this is how things will be, and it never cooperates with us on that.
It's just incredibly fascinating that the timeline, when you go beyond the traditional timeline and you get back into where you and Robert Schoch have speculated the age of the Sphinx, now you're talking about a completely different environment of lush rainforest and many, many, many resources.
Absolutely. We're talking about a completely different Sahara. And Schoch's evidence is of 1,000 years of heavy rainfall. That's what the Sphinx bears witness to, that it was already there when the rains of the Younger Dryas, and the Younger Dryas affected the Sahara with heavy rainfall. Just as further north it changed the climate and made it much colder in the Sahara, it became much wetter. And it's that period of rains that are the most likely culprit for weathering the Sphinx in the way it is. But it could have stood there for thousands of...
Qué interesante, porque pues todo el mundo conoce que obviamente pues no debería haber, o no tiende a haber, o no existe como tal la lluvia allá en el desierto, en el Sahara, todo eso, pero que el Sahara haya sido la tienda Sara haya sido un río, o sea, pues de ahí salió, como no, no, que imagínate ese pedo que antes era un lago, un río, y pues ahorita pues está bien jodido, o sea, ni agua ni nada, o sea, solo está ahí, no sé, está interesante.
Years before that.
There's also very clear evidence that the face in the Sphinx is much younger, right?
No doubt about that whatsoever. The first problem is the ancient Egyptians were masters of proportion. The ancient Egyptian art is rightly world famous for its quality, and they didn't get things out of proportion. They wouldn't make that elementary error when they create this giant statue, carving it out of solid bedrock. But the head of the Sphinx is way too small in relation to the body. It looks like the head of a pin. It doesn't fit with that 270-foot long, 70-foot high body. It looks very much as though the Sphinx once had a much larger head.
Can you show us a photo of it, Jamie? It's also much less weathered, right?
And it's much less weathered. And this is, again, where Egyptology tries to attach the Sphinx to a particular period. Egyptology claims that's the face of Khafre, who was the successor to Khufu. It doesn't look like any known statues of Khafre that I can see, but is called the Nemes headdress. It's the classic headdress of an Egyptian pharaoh. Not, in my view, Khafre, but the headdress of an Egyptian pharaoh. But it's on a head that is way too small by comparison with the body. And both Schoch and I and John Anthony West, Manu Seifzadeh, who's another excellent researcher in this field, we all feel that the Sphinx was almost certainly a complete lion at one point. It was a lion with a huge mane, and that head sticking up above the plateau got very heavily eroded, and by the time the ancient Egyptians inherited it, they decided to improve it a little bit, to cut down that heavily eroded head and put the head of a pharaoh on it.
Does it have the same sort of sophisticated proportions where they're perfect left and right as some of the other statues do, which is another incredible mystery? That when they look at the measurements of these immense statues, somehow or another they're completely symmetrical on both left and right side.
Completely symmetrical. I'm actually not sure whether that's the case with the Sphinx, but I wouldn't be surprised, because I have no doubt whatsoever that the head of the Great Sphinx was carved by the ancient Egyptians who made those statues. But the question is, what?
Pues ya ven, ¿no? Antes había el programa, por ejemplo, en el History Channel, de que como tal no de que genuinamente y por su madre decían que no, que las pirámides de Egipto y todo ese pedo, pues estaba hecho por aliens y que la madre, y es como que, vato, o sea, no manches. Pero hay mucha gente que se queda como que, pues, obviamente, güey, obviamente aliens. Pero es como que, vato, pues no le quites honor o prestigio a la pinche humanidad, güey. Pero también hay que verlo de que en aquellos tiempos, pues, era el cobre. El cobre dominaba, cabrón. No había otra cosa que no estuviera por encima del cobre, o sea, en cuanto a tecnología, en cuanto a utilización y todo eso. Así que, pues, obviamente hay gente que, pues, se saca de onda, que se queda como, pues, ¿cómo van a lograr este milagro de Dios? Bueno, milagro. Y no van a, o sea, con ellos, o sea, así de humanos. Pero es como que, vato, pues, lo están intentando, cabrón, o sea, qué curioso. Me marca que YouTube está teniendo problemas. Qué curioso.
Was it carved from? What was it cut down from?
Right.
So the geology, the precipitation-induced weathering is one of the pieces of evidence for a much older Sphinx. But the other thing is the astronomy, the fact that the Sphinx is an equinoctial marker. You know, if you stand looking due east at Giza or anywhere in the northern hemisphere on the spring equinox, there's 3 key moments of the year. 4, actually. There's the winter and summer solstice, and there's the equinoxes, the spring and fall equinoxes. On the summer solstice, the sun rises far to the north of east. On the winter solstice, it rises far to the south of east. But on the equinoxes, it aligns perfectly due east. And that's what the Sphinx is. It's aligned perfectly to due east, and it's gazing at the horizon. And then we come to this contentious issue of who discovered the zodiacal constellations. Because the Sphinx, 12,500 years ago, was gazing at dawn on the spring equinox at the constellation of Leo. In other words, this lion monument on the ground was looking at its own celestial counterpart in the sky. Egyptologists dismiss that. They say that nobody had any idea of the constellations until the Greeks. I think they're wrong. So astronomy and geology together combine to invite us to consider the possibility that the Sphinx may be much older than 4,500 years old.
Right.
I mean, I know you know that theory.
Yeah.
That
Absolutely.
is a crazy.
Ok, comentarios rapiditos sobre ese don. Como tal, está dictando que, pues obviamente, las pirámides pudieron haber sido algo, pues, más allá que solo pues, construcciones de nosotros, ¿no? Y, pues, cada quien. Pero básicamente se basa en la teoría de que, pues, hay evidencia de que esto pudo haber pasado antes, pudo haber, de que pudo haber pasado diferente, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Disculpen. Ya. Y de que, pues, previas civilizaciones y todo eso, ¿no? Clásico. Pero sí, como tal, pues la teoría de que hay evidencia de que posiblemente todo eso se hubiera hecho antes, todo eso se hubiera hecho diferente. Está muy interesante el concepto.
Theory that sounds it sounds completely wackadoo, but then when you have it laid out to you, Christopher, what's his last name?
Dunn. Christopher Dunn. I just had
Dunn.
him on my podcast a few weeks ago.
I just had him a couple weeks ago too.
Yeah.
I just had a brain fart. His depiction of the mechanisms that would be involved in turning this giant structure into some sort of a power plant. You hear about it, you go, wait a minute, whoa.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And him and I have very similar theories on how the power generation occurred. And I believe that the Nile, when it used to run up close to the pyramids, and the water would run underneath the pyramid, and that would create something called physiostatic electricity as it ran underneath that magnetized crystal granite. Those ions would pour up into the chamber, move up the grand gallery where there used to be resonating rods, where you can see the slots where the rods used to be. They're removed now, but the slots are still there. Then it would be pushed into the king's chamber where it would be amplified and some type of fusion would take place, then forced up through the apex, and then the crystal granite obelisks around the region would capture that ambient wireless electricity. And then if you had something called a JED, which looks like a Tesla coil, you can capture that energy and you can transfer it into a device for gold electroplating, for
Yo queriendo hablar, yo queriendo explicar y se me olvidó que tenía el pinche micrófono apagado. Qué güey. Ok, ahora sí. Básicamente, el vato, el morenillo, ahora sí que porque, pues ya ven. El vato prácticamente está explicando que están hablando del descubrimiento de hace 2 meses de que debajo de las pirámides se encontraron pilares, 8 pilares que conectaban con cada una de las tumbas secretas, y de hecho descubrieron apenas una tumba secreta gracias a eso. Utilizaron un satélite con un sonar especial para que ese sonar crear una imagen 3D sencilla del subsuelo, porque los egipcios son muy, ¿cómo decirlo? Les importa demasiado preservar su historia, así que no permiten que la gente se involucre mucho, haga mucho desentierro, busquen demasiado por dentro y cosas así, ¿no? Así que estos científicos dijeron, no, pues mejor, para no tocar nada, mejor hacemos esto de forma no invasiva. Y como lo hicieron, pues usaron ese satélite con ese super sonar para poder investigar debajo de la Tierra. Que encontraron este tipo de pilares. Obviamente este tipo no, ¿verdad? Porque esta es una imagen de AI, creo. Pero debajo de cada tumba encontraron pilares que iban 2 kilómetros por debajo del piso. Y luego esos 8 pilares eran 4 cada 4, o sea, un grupito de 4 y otro grupito de 4, conectaban directamente a 2 cubos que medían creo que 4 kilómetros por cara, bueno, ¿cómo se le dice? Por ángulo, no, por ángulo no, por lado, ¿no? 4 kilómetros por lado, y es un cubo, así que pues ya ahí hagan las matemáticas. Masivos, enormes, o sea, los pilares, está la pirámide, debajo están esos pilares y debajo están los cubos. Y básicamente en los pilares era como una secuencia en espiral. Ay, déjenme ver si me encuentro pilares, pirámides. No sé si lo voy a encontrar. El descubrimiento. No me gusta cómo se ve esa imagen. Ok, aquí. Literalmente esto fue lo que encontraron debajo de una de las más grandes pirámides. Literalmente esta espiral, estos cubos, prácticamente si estuvieran por encima del suelo, o sea, no estuvieran enterrados, esto sería la edificación más grande de todo el mundo. Así de alta y así de impresionante está la cosa. Sí, o sea, esas son las imágenes que ellos lograron capturar con ese satélite sonar. Es otro pedo, o sea, fue algo impresionante. Y de eso están hablando, ¿no? De que técnicamente la teoría es que debido a la forma en la que está, a la forma en que se distribuyen los espirales y todo, la teoría más tanto descabellada como comprobable que quieren seguir es de que la pirámide posiblemente era una fuente, era un sistema de, era un tipo receptor de energía, receptor y almacenamiento de energía. Está súper interesante y súper, ahora sí que como dicen, conspiranoide y todo el pedo. Pero bueno, sigamos, porque obviamente eso sería tecnología más allá de lo que suponemos que los egipcios deberían tener.
Any other electrical tools you need, like some of the tools they had to have used to create some of these incredible works of art, we can see the tool marks, so we know they had the tools. But they had wireless electricity way back then.
The
Sí, o
interesting
sea,
thing,
el hecho de que tuvieran electricidad inalámbrica en aquellos tiempos es una teoría súper descabellada, pero súper fascinante, que es básicamente lo que Nikola Tesla estuvo buscando, ¿no? Y muchos conocen esa historia, ¿no? De que pobre Tesla le hizo todo lo que pudo para poder inventar formas de que la electricidad en el aire pudiera ser transmitida hacia aparatos para no necesitar cables. Pero obviamente no creaba tanto dinero, así que mejor se fueron con algunos otros inventos, como los de Edison, como el foco, teléfono, cosas así. Porque eran cosas físicas que podían estar vendiendo o reparando. O por lo menos eso es lo que se cree, ¿no? Eso es lo que se cree de por qué no eligieron la energía limpia, preexistente y pues como tal mucho más funcional y así.
thing about the Amazon, Joe, is it's been grievously misunderstood over the years, and fortunately, archaeology is beginning to come to terms with it. There was agriculture in the Amazon, going back a very long way, going back at least 10,000 years, maybe further. And we may have discussed this before, but
Yeah,
there's this curious soil that exists in the Amazon that they call terra preta, or Amazonian dark earth. Recent investigations have shown without doubt that it's man-made and deliberately man-made, not an accidental result of refuse tips, but a deliberate attempt to make the Amazon fertile.
And how do they know that it's deliberate?
Because they find in it the same ingredients, and amongst those ingredients are always broken bits of ceramics. That's one of the odd things. They seem to be part of what makes it work.
Really?
Yeah,
Ceramics?
Ceramics, mixed in there with dung, with human refuse, all deliberately put in there, not an accidental dung heap, but a place that human beings said, we're going to make this ground fertile, because rainforest soils are not particularly fertile. The fertility of the Amazon comes entirely from the fall of leaves onto the soil. It refertilizes itself. But to grow crops on the Amazon is a very different prospect. And this is where terra preta really comes into its own. And I've been standing in a pit with an archaeologist there, a terra preta pit, and you can see this beautiful, rich soil. And it is a mystery. It constantly replenishes itself. It never gets used up. Settlers seek out areas of terra preta. And it fits with this notion that no longer a notion, it's a fact, that there was a population of millions in the Amazon 10,000 years ago. And they were living a highly productive, sophisticated life. They were using agriculture. They also gardened the Amazon. The hyperdominant trees in the Amazon are all food-bearing trees. The Brazil nut tree, for example, which is a huge, tall tree, is a food-bearing tree. And they exist in far greater numbers than they should do if they developed naturally. Humans manipulated the Amazon and made it serve human needs thousands and thousands of years ago. And then we have these enormous structures that are appearing in the Amazon, which are being referred to as geoglyphs. They call them geoglyphs after the Nazca lines, actually. The Nazca lines in Peru are huge ground images, sometimes geometrical in form, sometimes showing animals or birds or spiders, other creatures, often actually showing Amazonian animals. But in the Brazilian Amazon, in the state of Acre, as a result of clearances of the Amazon that have been done for farming purposes, there's this rush to just cut the Amazon down and replace it with cattle ranches and soybean farms. Those clearances have revealed something that, again, according to the old view of the Amazon, shouldn't be there, which is gigantic earthworks, huge ones, a bit like the henges in Europe, enormous.
Se me olvida quitar el mendigo, la pausa de micrófono. Ni me acuerdo si lo quité cuando hablé hace un poquito. Ok, básicamente está explicando que la tierra del Amazonas como tal no es súper fértil y hay demasiados árboles que dan comida como para que se hayan desarrollado naturalmente. Y hay ciertos pozos o lugares con tierra extremadamente fértil que de alguna forma siempre se van regenerando. Y los locareños pues siempre buscan estos lugares, ¿no? O sea, hay demasiadas coincidencias para que se haya desarrollado todo eso de forma natural. Y de que hay ciertas zonas como las que vimos en la pantalla que cuando los granjeros empiezan a talar y todo eso para poder hacer como granjas o así, pues empiezan a encontrar estas zonas extrañas.
Huge ones, a bit like the henges in Europe, enormous embankments, ditches, and in geometrical forms. So you get enormous squares, enormous circles. You get a circle within a square. They keep repeating these geometrical images, and they're thousands of years old. When we were down there just recently, we had a local LiDAR guy working with us. These days, you don't have to even use an airplane to find things with LiDAR. You can fly LiDAR off a drone. Oh. And flying his drone within a mile of known structures that are outside the rainforest now, he found 2 more huge geoglyphs under the rainforest canopy, which will be investigated. And this is bizarre and puzzling. They reckon, the team working on this, that's Marty Parsonen of the University of Helsinki and Alcea Ranzi, who's a Brazilian archaeologist and geologist, they reckon that there's thousands of these things still under the rainforest canopy, and there's a huge untold story. So one of the places I would look for a lost civilization is the Amazon rainforest.
So the Atlantis one.
So, yeah, the Rishat structure. I was wondering if you saw those videos, Joe.
Yeah, no, that was a big one that I saw because I've been fascinated by the concept of Atlantis. You know, ever since I had these conversations with Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock about the Younger Dryas impact theory and this concept that somewhere in the roughly around 11,000, 12,000 years ago, we were hit by a series of comets. And it's pretty evident that that's a fact. If you do the core samples of the Earth, they find this nuclear glass all over the Earth that exists in that time period. And it seems like something happened that reset civilization. And there's very little evidence of advanced civilizations before that up until recently, up until the last couple of decades. They started uncovering things like Göbekli Tepe, and all these other structures that are clearly from more than 12,000 years ago. And they're really complex and really large with enormous stones. And it's sort of caused people
Ya se me está volviendo una costumbre no quitar el bloqueo del micrófono. Ok, rapidito. Que fuimos pinches balaceados por meteoritos, cabrón. Y pues destruyó la civilización y apenas se reconstruyó y dinosaurios o los monos otra vez, lo que sea. El punto es de que nos rafallaron. También está la teoría de que las ondas electromagnéticas del planeta creo que es mínimo cada 50,000 años, máximo, no me acuerdo cuántos. Se modifican y el planeta vale madres. Y nosotros también, ¿no? Porque dependemos de la gravedad y todo ese pedo. Pero bueno, esas son teorías, ¿no? De que el mundo se destruye cada cierto tiempo, nosotros valemos madres y pues todo vuelve a comenzar.
To rethink the history of the Earth and the history of human civilizations. And Atlantis has always been the big one. That has been the one that everybody talked about, was this incredibly advanced civilization, and no one can figure out where it is.
Right.
Or if it was real.
Chale, le retrasé. A ver, ahorita lo acomodo, ¿no? Ahorita acomodo eso, ¿no? Pero mientras, sí, al parecer, ahorita lo van a hablar, pero hay mucha evidencia de que tal vez sí ya sabemos dónde está Atlantis. ¿Por qué? Porque hay evidencia de zonas muy inusuales en donde tal vez sí está. Y pues va a ser un poco interesante si logramos encontrarlo.
Necessarily the name, just through like the change of language, over, let's say 12, 13,000 years ago, which would be the time frame. So like surely there would be several different changes of language, but I think it represented a civilization that was doing great things. They were more global than what many people think would be possible. Atlantis was said to be a kingdom made up of, or an empire, made up of 10 kingdoms. And then there was the lost city of Atlantis, which was the capital, which was said to be made up of concentric circles, 2 of water, 3 of land, and essentially that they were obliterated by a cataclysm as passed down by Plato, although it's worth mentioning that Plato got the story of Atlantis from Solon, who was his uncle separated by 6 generations. But what most people don't realize is that Solon had traveled to Egypt, and so it's the ancient Egyptians is where that tale comes from, which makes it even more bizarre because I would argue that the most spectacular ancient civilization is the Egyptians. I mean, no disrespect to the Romans.
Hard to deny.
Right? I mean, let me just say, because I want to, on this podcast, encourage people to travel to Egypt. Joe, you got to go.
I really want to. A friend of mine just went.
Sí. Lo que siempre me pareció fascinante de Atlantis desde que, vato, ¿cómo vas a vivir en un río? En un río. En el mar y aún así desapareces, cabrón. Bueno, igual yo vi bien, güey, ¿no? Diciendo esas mamadas. Pero, sí, o sea, imagínate, un imperio de 10 países y una ciudad capital. Todos viviendo en el mar. Todos viviendo chido. Y por algunas razones tenían conexiones a los egipcios. Está súper raro porque, pues, cabrón, o sea, si vivo en el mar, ¿qué voy a andar haciendo ahí en Egipto? Donde no hay nada de agua. O sea, ¿eran primos lejanos o qué pedo?
And she got back and she was telling me incredible things about it. Jamie, will you pull up the photos of these concentric circles? Tell him.
Yeah, the Richat, R-I-C-H-A-T. It's worth mentioning
he's
that.
got it already here.
Yeah, in the first.
Ok, esos lugares son súper fascinantes. Básicamente van a explicar que estas son las zonas más probables en donde está el pinche Atlantis, cara. ¿Por qué? Por ciencia.
I just want to say it's Richat. I used to call it Ricot. I was mispronouncing it. But let me ask you this, Joe, real quick. When you saw my video, was that the very first time you had ever seen this thing before?
Sí, ese pedo, cabrón.
So many. When I first saw this, I was like, what the fuck is that? By the way, you see that white? All those white blemishes?
Uh-huh.
That's salt. This was under the ocean. And people, let me just say, you mentioned Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock. I love them. And I know for sure that they don't particularly think this is the site for a few different reasons. So let me say there's absolute doubt. Even I am not 100% certain. I'm not even 100% certain Atlantis existed. What I am certain is that humans were doing spectacular things in a
Sí, o sea, obviamente hay mucha gente que lo debate, ¿no? Richard. Pero la estructura de Richard son estos pinches círculos, o este pinche círculo principalmente. Ay, perdón, es que ya te necesito premio. Creo que este es falso. Estos círculos demasiado perfectos que fueron hechos de forma natural, o sea, no hay explicación definitiva de qué había ahí. Lo más inusual es de que esas zonas medio blanquillas que se ven, pues creo que estas son las mejores fotos que... Pero sí, o sea, básicamente esas zonas medio blancas son es sal marina, o sea, así de putazo, cabrón. O sea, y por alguna razón hay sal marina ahí casi en medio del pinche desierto. Y nadie sabe por qué. Y nadie sabe por qué ese círculo está ahí. O por qué esa cristalización de tierra, sal y la madre, pues está ahí. Y la mayoría de la gente cree que ahí es donde estaba Atlantis. Hay gente que lo debate, obviamente, y es lo razonable, cada quien. Pero es un lugar muy posible. Muy, muy posible.
Cataclysmic event happened called the Younger Dryas and reset something for somebody.
Is there a natural explanation for
Yes.
this formation?
Yes. So let me say that it is considered to be mysterious. They're not 100% certain of it. However, the consensus is that it was a volcanic dome that had risen and collapsed multiple times, like 100 million years ago, allegedly. I say allegedly, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that. I'm just saying I would like to know where sometimes they get these figures from. Like, explain to me why it was 100 million years ago and not 99 or 98, because here we are talking about how crazy things changed in just the last 12, 13,000 years. So when they throw around these numbers, 1 million years in itself is an incredibly long period of time. But getting back to your question, some had originally thought that maybe it was an impact site from an asteroid or perhaps, but there's no evidence for it. Like there's none of the
The problem is there's these concentric circles. I've never seen anything. I mean, obviously I'm not an archaeologist, but I've never seen anything like this in...
Hey, no había notado, este vasito es de Black Rifle Coffee. Black Rifle es una compañía de café de veteranos que pues ha habido controversia y bla, bla, ¿no? Ya nomás lo quería mencionar porque de hecho gracias a ellos me interesó mucho el mundo del café y en eso me dedico. Económicamente lamentable, así que pues chale.
I mean, if you study structures that are like man-made structures, I've never seen anything like this that humans have made, but I've definitely never seen like... Go to that one where your cursor's on, Jamie.
Please.
So is this...
You want to see some? All right.
What is this?
Okay.
Okay, one step at a time, because we also have to take into consideration that people are just listening. So kind of describe what we're looking at here.
Okay, so what you're looking at is approximately 250 miles inland in the total barren desert of Mauritania, Africa. So
but
the Western
this image
Sahara.
Looks like... Why is it blue?
That's just showing you
what it used to look like?
No, this is what it looks like right now through, I forgot what you call this type of animation, but it's a satellite imagery that they enhanced in order for you to see the difference in elevation and the actual structure to itself.
Okay, so like if there was water in this area, you would see it this way, that it would be these concentric circles that are raised above the water, and then the water would be inside of it like that.
Well, just to clarify, this particular image, no, this is not trying to represent water. So that blue is actually picking up on salt. So
salt, all that was salt. But I mean, it used to be underwater, right? It's salt because it was underwater.
That's what I believe, and that's what makes the most sense to me. Others will disagree, and let me tell you why. It is currently 1,300 feet above sea level. It's 250 miles inland. And so some people say this was never under the ocean, at least not for the last tens of millions of years, is what the scientists claim. I argue that since the salt is still there, and not only that, Jamie, if you go to the other images that show you more of the white, the one that you were previously on, the one to the middle to the left, right there. So those areas with the most white blemishes happen to be the areas that are the lowest in elevation, which to me tells me that saltwater had settled there. But not only that, Joe, Atlantis was said to be, like we said, multiple rings of, water and land. However, it was said to open to the sea to the south. And what you're looking at here, the south, so this is oriented north, south, east, and west. What do you see to the south? And especially if we could get another...
This is a very flat area that looks like it's the lowest elevation. Like around it looks like it's higher. I mean, it's hard to tell from this image.
Jamie, will you Google map it? Just type in... even if you went to Mauritania, so you could see this from space. Astronauts use it as a locator, and they weren't really familiar or aware of it until the Gemini missions in the early 1960s. So if you go to, if you just go to Google Earth, you'll be able to find this quite quickly. It stands out, and it's why they call it the Eye of Africa or the Eye of the Sahara. All right, so just pan out a little bit, and it'll provide us with keep going. All that white is salt.
Archaeologists should not seek to isolate the story of Atlantis from other flood myths and traditions all around the world. And that's a problem too. I mean, we have hundreds of myths and traditions from countries all around the globe which speak of a great global cataclysm, a huge flood, often wildfires, destruction of human beings and of animals, a few survivors who seek to restart civilization. It's a global story, not a single story told by Plato.
And, I mean, if you hear the same story from so many different cultures, at what point in time do you go, maybe there's...
Eso es un punto interesante que mucha gente no considera, cabrón. De que, pues, si tu compa te cuenta que esto pasó, y luego tu otro compa dice, esto pasó, y luego el compa de tu hermana le dice y ella te dice que esto pasó y todos están contando algo mayormente similar, pues obviamente vas a decir, pues no mames, o sea, creo que sí pasó. Creo que es real. Es como los mitos y las leyendas, ¿no? O sea, como que todo pinche México ha visto la leyenda, ha visto la pinche Llorona de noche en su colonia, cabrón. O el pinche cuento que está por toda la mendiga, por todo el mendigo país, de que en cada pinche local, en cada edificio que existe en México, se murió una niña, cabrón. En todo pinche local, en todas partes se murió una niña, güey. Y se aparece. A mi gata la espantó. Pero en todas partes hay una niña. A donde vayas, a donde entres a trabajar, a la escuela de la que estés, ahí se murió una niña por alguna pinche razón. No sé por qué es una niña, ¿no? Pinches feministas. Pero por alguna razón. Y pues sí, o sea, sí, el punto es de que si tantas culturas tienen esta historia, si tantas culturas están contando algo similar, tienen cosas por igual, la historia, la anécdota, si te lo cuenta Franco, si te lo cuenta Carlos, o sea, el punto es de que tal vez hay algo en eso que puede llegar a ser verdad, porque ya es demasiada coincidencia que sean tan iguales, cabrón. Pero pues ahí va.
There's something to this. I mean, it's just very strange to try to deny that.
Again, we have this...
Especially with the physical evidence.
Yeah, especially with the physical evidence. And it's interesting with the physical evidence, like Göbekli Tepe, which is 11,600 years old. I mean, it used to be argued, Robert Schoch and John Anthony West's work on the Great Sphinx, suggesting that the Sphinx could be 12,000 plus years old. It used to be argued that was impossible because there was no other site anywhere in the world, no other megalithic site of the same age. And then we discover Göbekli Tepe, and it's 11,600 years old. Now, if you can make Göbekli Tepe with its 20-ton megaliths, beautifully carved representations of human and animal figures in those pillars, if you can do that, you can cut the Great Sphinx out of bedrock as well. There's no reason to dismiss the geological evidence of the Great Sphinx anymore, but instead, what archaeology is doing is trying to finesse Göbekli Tepe. They're trying to say, oh, there was this gradual build-up to Göbekli Tepe, and they now talk about a people who they call the Natufians. Again, we don't know what they called themselves, who were predecessors of Göbekli Tepe around 14,000 years ago. And they show things that look like a tiny little stone wall that they built, the sort of thing that you can find, a dry stone wall that you can find anywhere in Wales to this day, you know. And this is supposed to be a prequel to Göbekli Tepe. I'm sorry, you just don't start off making dry stone walls and then wake up one morning and create 20-ton megaliths in huge stone circles, perfectly astronomically aligned, as we have at Göbekli Tepe.
Not only that, but how? Like, what did they do? How are you even? Where are you getting those 20-ton megaliths from? How far do they have to transport?
In the case of Göbekli Tepe, not far. Hundreds of meters. I've stood on top of one megalith that they partially cut out of the bedrock with the T-shape, but then they found a fault in it and they left it there. It would have been a 30-ton megalith. They clearly intended to release it from the bedrock, but it had a fault, so they left it alone. The quarries, the issue of the quarries for the rock at Göbekli Tepe is not too big a problem.
But the transportation of those?
Even the transportation, you get enough people working together, and they can move large stones. That's not in dispute. But that's where the question comes: how do you get enough people together? How do you have the organizational skills? Where do you have the mindset that plans something like this at the beginning? And that is the problem that is not answered in the case of Göbekli Tepe. That happening suddenly.
No, pues cuando llevas siglos y siglos, cabrón, de trabajo sin salario, de condiciones hoy en día tercermundistas, creo que sabes cómo manejar pinches esclavos, ¿no? O sea, ¿cómo decir? ¿Cómo esos? ¿De dónde sale tanto pinche mexicano, cabrón? Y luego vas a México y dices, no, pues con razón. Desde los 15 años estas pinches viejas están apareando, o sea, no mames. Que está bien enfermo, cabrón, o sea. Obviamente la mayoría pues es entre morrillos, ¿no? Pinches niños que apenas van entrando a prepa y pues se creen bien machos, cabrón, pero es ridículo, ¿verdad? Pero de ahí viene esta población, por así decirlo.
And what were they using for tools?
They're supposed to have just been using stone. There's not supposed to have been any metals at that period.
Not even brass.
Not even brass. Not even copper. I have a complicated view on Göbekli Tepe. Let's say it's my hypothesis. It's not a fact. I don't claim this is a fact. I think that what we're looking at Göbekli Tepe, there's no doubt that the population of around Göbekli Tepe were all hunter-gatherers when Göbekli Tepe started to be made. And that's the weirdest thing of all, because previously archaeology always used to say hunter-gatherer cultures did not have the manpower, did not have the organizational skills, could not generate the surpluses that would allow people to specialize in architecture and engineering and astronomy and so on. So it used to be said that hunter-gatherers couldn't do that. Now archaeologists have backpedaled on that and they're saying, well, yeah, clearly hunter-gatherers did it. The funny thing is that during the 1,000 years that Göbekli Tepe functions, and it runs from roughly 11,600 years ago to, say, 9,600 years ago, during the 10,600 years ago, during those 1,000 years, the population of Göbekli Tepe transitions from being hunter-gatherers to being agriculturalists. So we see two new ideas suddenly appearing at Göbekli Tepe: enormous megalithic architecture and a shift from hunter-gathering to agriculture. And what Göbekli Tepe looks like to me is a transfer of technology, that people who already knew how to work megalithic architecture and align it precisely to the risings of particular stars, for example, Sirius, came to Göbekli Tepe.
Ok, básicamente entonces está diciendo que tal vez alguna civilización diferente llegó y le dijo, y apenas van en esto, chéquense. Y les pasó un chotazo de inteligencia y ya se fueron desarrollando, ¿no? Literalmente fue un putazo, o sea, gente que cazaba y recolectaba, ahora de chingadazo empieza a hacer agricultura. Gente que apenas si construía cuevas, ahora está haciendo superedificaciones. O sea, hay muchas coincidencias que pues quieren más o menos querer explicar sobre este tipo de cosas.
Be pushed into the king's chamber where it would be amplified and some type of fusion would take place, then forced up through the apex and then the crystal granite obelisks around the region would capture that ambient wireless electricity. And then if you had something called a JED, which looks like a Tesla coil, you can capture that energy and you can transfer it into a device for gold electroplating, for any other electrical tools you need, like some of the tools they had to have used to create some of these incredible works of art. We can see the tool marks, so we know they had the tools. But they had wireless electricity way back then.
The interesting thing about the Amazon, Joe, is it's been grievously misunderstood over the years, and fortunately archaeology is beginning to come to terms with it. There was agriculture in the Amazon, going back a very long way, going back at least 10,000 years, maybe further. And we may have discussed this before, but there's this curious soil that exists in the Amazon that they call terra preta, or Amazonian dark earth. Recent investigations have shown without doubt that it's man-made and deliberately man-made, not an accidental result of refuse tips, but a deliberate attempt to make the Amazon fertile.
And how do they know that it's deliberate?
Because they find in it the same ingredients, and amongst those ingredients are always broken bits of ceramics. That's one of the odd things. They seem to be part of what makes it work.
Really?
Yeah. Ceramics mixed in there with dung, with human refuse, all deliberately put in there, not an accidental dung heap, but a place that human beings said, we're going to make this ground fertile, because rainforest soils are not particularly fertile. The fertility of the Amazon comes entirely from the fall of leaves onto the soil. It refertilizes itself. But to grow crops on the Amazon is a very different prospect. And this is where terra preta really comes into its own. And I've been standing in a pit with an archaeologist there, a terra preta pit, and you can see this beautiful, rich soil. And it is a mystery. It constantly
them up. Yeah, when you put a Geiger counter over them, again, they talk about this war, right? And this war that occurred, there's a lot of wars, obviously, but this one particular war, it seems like the same one that damaged the area or the region of the Giza Plateau, also Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley up there by Pakistan. And the reason why it's interesting is if you look at the war in the text and then go to those areas, it looks now almost you can begin to see, oh, wait a minute, it looks like war. Mohenjo-Daro, Indus Valley, the buildings turned to glass. The sand turned to glass, and the bodies are still laying in the street right now today, holding hands, never been scavenged by animals. So
wait a minute, where is this?
Mohenjo-Daro.
Are there photos that we can look at?
Oh, yeah, look it up. Mohenjo-Daro, Indus Valley, dead bodies still laying in the street thousands of years later. And
they just lay there? No one's covered them up?
Nobody's covered them up. Yeah, when you put a Geiger counter over them, higher than background level radiation. Okay?
Really?
Yeah.
But aren't stones higher than background level radiation?
Some stones are. Stones are, especially like diorite and crystal granite. But these bodies, these are just bones. How come they're higher than background level radiation?
I can't wait to see this.
Yeah.
Why haven't I ever heard of this?
Mohenjo-Daro, M-O-H-E-N. There you go.
Whoa.
Yeah, this is evidence of a nuclear war or nuclear type of war.
Go back to the other, that one there. That one's insane.
Yeah. There's bodies that are sitting on the edge of steps next to their own buildings that they lived in. The building is turned to glass.
O sea, ¿qué onda, cabrón? Básicamente, pues, ¿qué es esto? Best viewers on those rockets. Ok, it's van 2021. Puedo imaginar que eres un bot o algún extranjero queriendo hacer dinero. Así que sí, no confiar en ti. Muchas gracias. Pero bueno, sí, básicamente este vato pues está diciendo, ¿no? Que estas radiaciones, esta cosa tan bizarra, básicamente, pues la gente quedó impregnada en ese pedo.
That's 3,000 plus degree temperature weapons fire.
So there's a bunch of people that seem to die all at once, just scattered around?
Yeah.
Now, what's the conventional explanation for how these people died?
They have no idea. They have zero idea. The only thing that
was just a couple, Jamie. Go to the other, just the Mohenjo-Daro mythical massacre.
Yeah.
So did they think it's a massacre? Is there any? What if the guy's just laying there?
Just laying there. And that building, those stones are vitrified, which means 3,000 plus degree temperature.
Oh shit!
What could have caused that level of temperature, energetic release
Well, it could have been a low atmosphere asteroid.
It could have been.
I mean, just like
that's possible.
Tunguska.
Yeah, it could have been a lot, but then their bones would have been splattered apart and broken into pieces.
Good call. Yeah, that's a good call. Yeah, because they don't seem to be broken apart.
No, they're not broken apart.
Right.
That impact would have shattered the bones and spread them out over a great distance.
But without impact, even if you just look at the one that burst in the atmosphere in Tunguska, it just flattened trees.
Flattened everything, all the trees.
I think it's some insane, like 1 million acres or something crazy.
Yeah, it's incredible. So
how
those
big was
bodies
the
would have been
Tunguska explosion? That one's, so those bodies would be toast because the trees were ripped apart.
The buildings would have been flattened.
The legs would have flown off.
Right.
There's no way they would just be laying there like that.
Exactly.
That's interesting. And they don't seem to be like chopped up.
No.
Did they have any evidence of stab wounds or anything on them?
They don't have any evidence of any injury, of any kind of attack or any cutting or like swords or anything.
They just all got cooked.
Right. And then in the tablets it says that the evil wind moved over the land after they released these weapons. And then Enki goes to his father. Enki goes to his father Anu and says, "Hey, can you stop the evil wind?" Because he had fallen in love with some people, and down there. And he's like, "There's nothing I can do." He said, "Get in your skyship and for a boat." That means get the hell out of here. And he said the people's hair was falling out, their eyes were bleeding, their nose were bleeding, their fingernails were curling off. That sounds like radiation sickness.
So you think it's radiation sickness that did this to all these people, or was it an impact that did this to all these people?
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. But they're not blown apart.
Right. They're not blown apart. It seems like whatever struck or whatever energetic weapon it was, it could have been might not have been a weapon. Whatever it was, it seems like that shock wave reached them at some point, and whatever was in that wave
just killed everybody.
That's what it did. Yeah.
And
sí, o sea, pues, una explosión o calor, este tipo de cosas, ¿no? Básicamente eso quieren explicar, que toda esta gente pues quedó totalmente impregnada, paralizada, etcétera, etcétera, pues por algo. Y que fue hace demasiado tiempo como para lograr identificar de forma adecuada, ¿no? Pues es extraño, pero es interesante. Y pues está eso, también está la teoría de que múltiples gigantes asteroides y fueron siguiendo chocando con nosotros y así, ¿no? Incluso está la teoría de que de que los humanos eran de Marte o de la Luna y de que logramos traspasar la Tierra y que la Luna fue atacada por asteroides o así, y por eso están los cráteres, o sea, que técnicamente no son formaciones regulares los cráteres de la Luna, ¿verdad? Pero no sé, está súper interesante ese tipo de temas, cara. Ay, chale, ok, la verdad esperaba encontrar otro tipo de videos sobre esa cosa, pero bueno, creo que hasta ahí lo voy a dejar. Tal vez a la siguiente voy a ver otro para complementar este video. Pero si no tienes estupidez nunca he visto. Sí, este tipo de videos están muy bizarros. Pero sí, básicamente no, de que antes había civilizaciones antiguas, medio raras y así, que fueron destruidas ya sea por cataclismos, por cosas de la naturaleza, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Está súper interesante este pedo. Muy bien. Ahora, no sé si se va a transferir la pantalla. Ah, sí se transfiere todo. Pum. Ok. Permítanme un momento. Pero bueno, ok. Sí, es cierto. La neta sí quisiera desarrollar más ese tema de las civilizaciones antiguas. A ver. Crazy. Okay. A ver, ¿cómo sería? Natural disasters. Pueden criticar mi inglés, pero me dará igual porque sé que está horrible. Permítanme. Ya, ok. Ok. Creo que esto no es lo que estaba buscando. Pero... A ver, creo que este servirá.
This is where it gets fascinating.
We now know.
Ay, me fui.
You want to hear something really fascinating?
Sure. Plato, which is the
A ver, déjame volver a recargar porque creo que la cagué ahorita. A ver, espérame. Déjame correr. Está.
This is where it gets fascinating.
We now know that at that time, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, truly global cataclysmic events involving rapid rises in sea level did occur. You know, you could look at these giant boulders called glacial erratics, and they just look odd sitting there in the landscape. But when you really consider how they got there, that they got there in icebergs the size of oil tankers, that were carried on floods that were at least 500 up to 1,000 feet deep, that were tearing through the channeled scablands, literally ripping the landscape apart. When you look at that and you think anything that was underneath that 12,800 years ago is gone completely.
This is where it gets fascinating.
We now know that at that
Sí, o sea,
time
está
between
súper interesante. ¿Por qué? Porque, o sea, hay demasiadas cosas inusuales que podrían ser verdad, obviamente, sobre las civilizaciones antiguas y todo eso. O sea.
I've heard about the reset, but I'd talk more about that because
They think that there was natural disasters, probably comet impacts, around 11,800 years ago. And
Okay,
it reset civilization. It probably knocked us back into the Stone Age.
Yeah.
And that it makes sense if you think about the, like, when you're talking like 1,000 years ago with the Vikings and 2,000 years ago with the Romans, and just how savage and barbaric people were. But yet thousands of years before that, they built the pyramids. Like, how'd they do that? Well, if something happened that like wiped everyone out back down to like just pure savage people that just scratching and clawing to stay alive, and then they rebuilt civilization, boy, you would have the echoes of that barbarism just running through cultures.
I've heard about the reset, but I'd talk more about that because
They think that there was natural disaster.
Ok, pues sí, básicamente es eso, ¿no? Y la neta les recomiendo escuchar, si entienden el inglés, 100% les recomiendo escuchar el podcast de Joe Rogan. Mucha gente lo verá de forma negativa, principalmente por la situación de las vacunas, lo cual, como ciudadano responsable del mundo, debería saber que la situación del COVID fue una de las conspiraciones más ridículas e impresionantes que hubo. Yo caí, lo admito, yo me vacuné y todo. Por suerte solo fue una, no las 343.LGTB cantidades de refuerzos que hubo sobre esas pinches vacunas, pero sí, pues ya ven. Así es la vida.
I've heard about the reset, but I'd talk more about that because
they think that there was natural disasters, probably comet impacts, around 11,800 years ago. And
Okay,
it reset civilization. It probably knocked us back into the Stone Age.
Yeah.
And that it makes sense if you think about the, like, when you're talking like 1,000 years ago with the Vikings and 2,000 years ago with the Romans, and just how savage and barbaric people were. But yet thousands of years before that, they built the pyramids. Like, how'd they do that? Well, if something happened that like wiped everyone out back down to like just pure savage people that just scratched and clawing to stay alive, and then they rebuilt civilization, boy, you would have the echoes of that barbarism just running through cultures. It looks like the idea of the start of civilization being around 6,000 years ago is a restart of civilization.
That
So
has to be.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I've heard about the reset, but I talk more about that because
They think that there was natural disasters, probably comet impacts, around 11,800 years ago. And
Okay,
it reset civilization.